St. Margaret's Churchyard in Barking is a historic, quiet patch of green in East London. Over 15 months, it became an open-air dumping ground for a serial killer. 4 young men were found dead within a few hundred feet of each other, propped against stone walls or discarded under trees. The real horror wasn't just the murders. It was that the police walked right past the bodies, dismissing a mounting pile of corpses as isolated accidents. While authorities looked the other way, a predator operated in plain sight, hunting from his smartphone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Barking is a dense East London district where the historical collides with the industrial. It is a landscape defined by concrete housing estates, transit hubs, and a constantly shifting population. Nestled within this grid sits Cook Street, an unremarkable row of flats. The geographic radius of the impending tragedy was suffocatingly small. The entire hunting ground, the kill site, and the graveyard existed within a footprint of barely a quarter mile. Living at 58 Cook Street was Stephen Port. Approaching 40, he presented a profoundly mundane figure. He worked antisocial hours as a chef at a bus garage, preparing meals for transit workers. Neighbors perceived him as a quiet, solitary individual. His physical appearance was unassuming, tall but slumping, naturally bald, though he frequently wore an unconvincing blonde toupee. Inside his flat, the environment was strangely juvenile. He hoarded action figures, arranging them obsessively across his furniture. It was an existence defined by deep isolation. There were no outward signs of aggression, and absolutely nothing to alert law enforcement to the predator residing in their jurisdiction. That was only Port's physical reality. The true scope of his psychological landscape existed entirely online. Behind locked doors, he cultivated a sprawling digital empire built on deception. Proximity-based dating applications had altered how people connected, and Port weaponized this architecture. He maintained dozens of fake profiles across multiple platforms, curating personas that projected everything he lacked: wealth, physical fitness, and professional success. Using stolen photographs of models and military personnel, he created irresistible digital honey traps. This activity was not an attempt at genuine connection. It was an obsessive pursuit of total control, rooted in extreme fetishes. Port fixated on drug-induced compliance. He spent hundreds of hours scouring obscure internet forums, researching the physiological effects of various compounds. He needed to know the exact dosage required to render an adult male completely unconscious without instantly stopping his heart. His chemical weapon became gamma-hydroxybutyrate, GHB. While used recreationally in fractional quantities, the massive doses Port prepared were designed to induce deep, unrousable comas. His smartphone offered an endless, scrolling menu of targets passing within thousands of feet of his door. Into this invisible web stepped Anthony Walgate. At 23 years old, the fashion student from Hull was the absolute antithesis of his killer. Anthony was vibrant, ambitious, and entirely focused on building a career in London's competitive design industry. Peers recognized his rare creative spark and magnetic energy. He was meticulously constructing a bright future. Surviving in an expensive metropolis required capital. To fund his heavy tuition, Anthony occasionally engaged in escort work. It was a pragmatic, transactional decision. He understood the inherent risks of meeting strangers, usually relying on strict safety protocols and checking in with friends to monitor his location. In June 2014, Anthony's path intersected with one of Port's fabricated personas. The predator offered a highly lucrative sum for an overnight booking, an amount significant enough to persuade the student to travel eastward. Anthony believed he was meeting a wealthy, sophisticated client. He was an entrepreneur fulfilling a contract, completely unaware he was walking into a meticulously researched chemical snare set by a man hiding behind a digital mask. The smartphone screen glowed in the dim light of the Cook Street flat, illuminating a scrolling grid of faces. In 2014, the architecture of dating applications was still relatively novel, built on a foundation of GPS tracking and instant gratification. For a predator, it was a revolution. There was no need to stalk alleyways or lurk in physical shadows. The hunt had been digitized. Port could sit on his worn sofa surrounded by children's toys, watching the exact distance between himself and his targets update in real time, shrinking from miles to feet. He understood that proximity was only half the trap. The other half was psychological manipulation. The men he targeted were young, often navigating the heavy financial pressures of London, or dealing with the profound isolation of moving to a new, unforgiving city. Port exploited these specific vulnerabilities by engineering a stable of highly curated digital avatars. He was never Stephen Port, the bus garage chef. Instead, he presented himself as an Oxford-educated scholar, a wealthy investor, or a rugged military officer. He stole photographs from legitimate social media accounts, crafting backstories with meticulous detail to project wealth, authority, and security. He did not just cast a wide net, he tailored the bait. The cornerstone of his methodology was the introduction of synthetic chemicals. Port spent extensive time on underground forums studying the physiological effects of gamma-hydroxybutyrate and its precursor, gamma-butyrolactone. Referred to simply as G or liquid ecstasy, it is essentially an industrial solvent. In fractional quantities, it lowers inhibitions. But the margin between a euphoric high and total respiratory failure is microscopic, often just a few milliliters. Port was not a precision chemist. He was a man pouring a salty, slightly metallic liquid into a glass of soda or juice, completely indifferent to that lethal margin. He wasn't looking for a shared recreational experience. He was engineering total, paralyzing compliance. The drug acts quickly on the central nervous system, dropping the core body temperature and depressing the heart rate until the victim slips into a deep, unrousable coma. That was the ultimate goal. Total control over a helpless physical form. This was the invisible snare Anthony Walgate walked toward in the second week of June. The digital negotiations had been brisk. Operating under a pseudonym, Port recognized the student's need for capital. Fashion school in the capital required endless funding for materials and tuition. The Avatar offered an exorbitant fee for a single overnight booking, reportedly around £800. It was an amount specifically calculated to override any instinctual hesitation. Anthony was not naive. He operated within a dangerous industry and understood the absolute necessity of safety protocols. Before leaving his own apartment, he engaged his standard contingency plan. He contacted a close friend, explicitly detailing his plans for the evening. He provided the exact address he was heading to in Barking. He established a timeline for when he would check in next. He left a clear, unmistakable digital breadcrumb trail, trusting that if something went wrong, his location was logged. On the evening of June 18th, Anthony navigated the heavy transit systems of the London Underground. He rode the District Line as it pushed further east, the dense historic architecture of the city center gradually giving way to the gray, sprawling industrial zones of the outer boroughs. The atmosphere was typical of early summer in the city, warm, heavy, and stifling. As the train rattled toward the Barking station, Port was already preparing the environment. The liquid solvent was measured. The messages on the phone grew more frequent, guiding the young man step by step through the maze of residential streets. Anthony followed the digital map, his footsteps echoing on the concrete pavements, closing the final few hundred feet to the destination. He approached the ground floor entrance of 58 Cook Street. When the door finally opened, the psychological trap reached its critical juncture. The visual dissonance would have been immediate and jarring. The man standing in the doorway bore absolutely no resemblance to the polished, successful avatar from the application. Instead of a wealthy client, Anthony was faced with a tall, awkwardly slumping figure wearing an ill-fitting blonde hairpiece. But the promise of the cash was heavy in the air. The long journey east had already been made. In that split second of hesitation, standing on the threshold between the safety of the street and the claustrophobic interior of the flat, Anthony made the pragmatic decision to finish the job he was hired for. He stepped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing him inside a meticulously designed nightmare. Within minutes, a glass was offered. The glass was handed over. The liquid inside was heavily laced with a sweet mixer, designed specifically to mask the sharp, metallic bite of the industrial solvent. Anthony consumed it. Gamma-hydroxybutyrate is brutal in its efficiency. It does not induce a gentle, drifting sleep. It aggressively attacks the central nervous system, crossing the blood-brain barrier with violent speed. Within minutes, Anthony's muscles went completely slack. The ambient hum of the flat faded from his awareness. His breathing became shallow, erratic, then ceased entirely. The room grew quiet. Port did not panic. There were no frantic attempts at resuscitation, no sudden remorse. He simply observed the physiological mechanics of death. The psychological thrill was the absolute control, turning a vibrant, ambitious youth into a compliant, inanimate object. But that object quickly became a logistical liability. Moving a human corpse is a violently physical endeavor. Dead weight is fiercely uncooperative. Joints lock, limbs drag. Port waited until the deep silence of the early morning hours on June 19th. The streets of Barking were deserted. He hoisted Anthony's 150-pound frame, wrestling it out the front door, across the threshold, and dragged him onto the harsh concrete of Cook Street. He left the student propped awkwardly against a brick wall, mere feet from his own entrance. Returning inside, Port picked up his phone. He dialed emergency services, fabricating a clinical, detached narrative for the operator. He claimed he had just returned from a night shift and stumbled upon an unconscious youth on the pavement. He feigned total ignorance. He provided no name. When the paramedics arrived, they found a body already cooling in the damp London air. Port watched the flashing lights from the safety of his window. The ease with which he escaped scrutiny emboldened him. He realized he had successfully manipulated the system. By August, the digital trap was reset. The second target was Gabriel Kovary, a 22-year-old Slovakian immigrant. Gabriel was drifting. He lacked a permanent address, slept on friends' sofas, and was desperately seeking stability in a new country. Port sensed this profound vulnerability. Operating under the guise of a generous local professional, he offered the young immigrant a spare room at Cook Street. Gabriel accepted the lifeline. The reality of the flat was starkly different from the digital promises. The environment was cramped, cluttered with juvenile action figures. But before Gabriel could safely extract himself, the chemical snare was sprung. The GHB was administered. The result was identical to the first. Gabriel succumbed to lethal toxicity on the worn sofa. Port now faced a more complex disposal. He could not leave a second body on his own doorstep without triggering alarms. He needed a graveyard. Less than a quarter mile from his flat lay St. Margaret's Churchyard. It is an ancient, sprawling patch of green, dotted with weathered headstones and thick foliage. It provided the perfect, obscured canvas. Port wrapped Gabriel's body in a bedsheet to minimize friction and prevent forensic transfer. He waited for the dead of night. Dragging a fully grown man through urban streets requires immense, sustained exertion. The sound of scuffing heels on asphalt, the heavy, labored breathing of the predator in the dark. Port hauled Gabriel into the churchyard, pulling him deep into the shadows near the abbey ruins. He positioned the body against a stone wall, leaving a pair of sunglasses resting bizarrely near the corpse. He turned around, walked back to Cook Street, and locked his door. The hunger for control rapidly escalated. Merely 3 weeks later, in September, 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth became the third target. Daniel was a chef from Gravesend, enticed to Barking through the exact same predatory channels. Port's methodology was now practiced, efficient, and ruthlessly mechanical. The digital invitation, the arrival, the lethal dose of liquid ecstasy. Daniel died quickly on the floor of the Cook Street flat. This time, Port introduced an element of calculated narrative forgery. He recognized that the geographical proximity of the deaths might finally arouse suspicion. He needed a psychological smokescreen. Finding a piece of paper, Port drafted a fake suicide note. He wrote from Daniel's perspective, confessing to the accidental overdose of Gabriel Kovary. The forged letter claimed Daniel had panicked during a drug binge, dumped Gabriel's body, and was now taking his own life out of overwhelming guilt. It was an act of supreme arrogance. Port was essentially writing a script for the authorities, handing them a neatly packaged, closed case. Under the cover of darkness, Port transported Daniel to the exact same churchyard. He dragged the 160-pound frame over the damp grass, navigating the uneven terrain and centuries-old graves. He dumped Daniel's body less than a few dozen feet from where he had left Gabriel weeks prior. He He carefully slipped the forged suicide note into the young man's clothing, ensuring it would be found during the initial physical examination. The sheer audacity of the staging was staggering. He relied entirely on the assumption that investigators would accept the easiest story available. A full year passed. The flat on Cook Street remained undisturbed by law enforcement. Port operated with absolute impunity. By September 2015, the digital hunting resumed. Jack Taylor, 25 years old, was a night shift forklift driver. He was physically robust, heavily built, and possessed a quiet, hard-working demeanor. Surveillance cameras captured the stark reality of the encounter. The footage showed the predator, unremarkable, slouched, and awkward, leading the muscular, athletic Jack through the fluorescent-lit barking station toward the domestic slaughterhouse. Inside, the solvent was deployed. The chemical did not discriminate against physical strength. The central nervous system failure was absolute. The heavy musculature went entirely slack. Jack died in the early hours. The disposal of Jack Taylor required extreme physical force. This was not a slight student. This was a heavily muscled warehouse worker. Port waited until 1 a.m. He gripped the dead weight. He dragged the body out of the flat, scraping across the linoleum, down the hall, and out into the biting autumn air. He retraced the exact same path to St. Margaret's churchyard. The physical toll of moving a man of Jack's size over a quarter mile was immense. Port leveraged brute force, sweating under the heavy load, hauling the frame inch by inch through the sleeping neighborhood. He pulled the remains through the iron gates of the cemetery. Exhausted, he discarded the body in the dirt near the rubbish bins bordering the sacred ground. He left the forklift driver abandoned like refuse, turning his back on the final victim, supremely confident that the authorities would, once again, fail to see the monster standing in the light. The morning after Anthony Walgate was found propped against the cold brickwork of Cook Street, the bureaucratic machinery of the local constabulary engaged and immediately stalled. Port had called emergency services, weaving a detached, fabricated narrative about stumbling upon an unconscious stranger after a night shift. When officers finally applied basic pressure, his story fractured. He admitted to hiring the student and moving the corpse out of his flat. For this obstruction, Port was charged with perverting the course of justice in early 2015. However, the system's myopic focus meant the inquiry halted right there. Despite possessing a dead body, a confessed liar, and the perpetrator's laptop, which was saturated with extreme chemical fetish material, the authorities classified the death as a non-suspicious overdose. Port was handed an 8-month sentence, served barely a fraction of it, and was quietly released back to Barking. In Hull, Anthony's family received the devastating news through a wall of institutional apathy. The detectives had categorized the victim based on his profession, and in their eyes, his lifestyle negated the necessity for a homicide unit. Weeks later, the historic churchyard became a focal point of supreme investigative negligence. The sheer statistical impossibility of the subsequent discoveries should have triggered a massive tactical response. A local dog walker, navigating the dew-soaked grass and weathered headstones near the abbey, ruins in late August, stumbled upon Gabriel Cavari. The body was slumped unnervingly against the crumbling masonry. Barely 3 weeks later, the morning air was split by the exact same dog walker's frantic call to dispatch. In the identical quadrant of the cemetery, nestled against the damp earth, lay Daniel Whitworth. The fatal levels of the industrial solvent found in their toxicology reports were staggering. The sheer volume required to kill an adult male so rapidly makes voluntary, recreational ingestion highly improbable, especially alone in a dark, outdoor setting. Yet the coroner's findings were rubber-stamped by detectives eager to clear their caseloads. The linchpin of this systemic failure rested on a single piece of lined paper, the forged suicide note planted on Daniel. Procedural doctrine dictates that such a document be subjected to rigorous forensic scrutiny, including handwriting analysis and fingerprinting. None of this occurred. The lead investigators sealed the note in a plastic evidence bag and treated it as an absolute truth. They summoned Daniel's parents to a sterile briefing room and delivered a fabricated reality, informing the grieving couple that their son had accidentally killed Gabriel during a drug binge and taken his own life in remorse. Daniel's parents immediately protested. They stated unequivocally that the handwriting did not match their son's. They explicitly pointed out that Daniel had no connection to Barking, no history of chemical abuse, and zero links to Gabriel Cavari. The officers listened to the distressed family, nodded politely, and formally closed the inquiry. The red flags were not just missed, they were actively buried. By late 2014, a heavy, paranoid atmosphere descended over the local community. Barking residents began connecting the dots that law enforcement aggressively ignored. Whispers circulated through the transit hubs and concrete housing estates. 3 young men had died under identical circumstances within a footprint of a few hundred feet. A local digital newspaper ran a speculative piece questioning the staggering coincidences. In response, the borough commander issued rigid statements meant to pacify the public. The official line was absolute. There was no evidence of foul play, no active predator, and the deaths were entirely unrelated. This blind spot was fueled by a lethal institutional bias. Because the victims were gay men and the chemical weapon was associated with the underground party scene, investigators viewed the corpses through a lens of moral judgment. They classified them as high-risk individuals who had simply pushed a dangerous habit too far. The police did not see a serial killer's dumping ground. They saw a localized nuisance. This profound apathy provided Port with his greatest camouflage. The absolute breaking point arrived in September 2015 with the discovery of Jack Taylor. Discarded by the churchyard rubbish bins, his death was instantly processed through the identical, flawed template. Overdose. Non-suspicious. Case closed. But the authorities severely miscalculated the resolve of the Taylor family. Jack's sisters possessed an intimate understanding of his baseline behavior. He was a forklift driver subject to random workplace drug testing. He was meticulously focused on his physical health and vehemently anti-drugs. He did not engage in chemical binges, and he certainly did not travel to a random East London cemetery to end his life. When the family was informed there would be no homicide investigation, their grief metastasized into absolute fury. They demanded access to the case files and were immediately stonewalled. The police explicitly refused to pull the localized surveillance footage from the train station, citing a lack of resources for a non-criminal matter. The sisters recognized that if the killer was going to be caught, they had to circumvent the constabulary entirely. They launched an aggressive civilian inquiry, breaking through Jack's passwords to retrace his final digital interactions. They mapped the agonizingly short route from the transit hub to the surrounding streets. They physically walked the pavement, identifying privately owned security cameras attached to local off-licenses and apartment blocks. They begged the proprietors to preserve the footage before the systems automatically overwrote the hard drives. Every hour mattered. The sisters were racing against digital decay, acting as the primary investigative force, while the actual detectives remained entrenched behind their desks, completely blind to the monster operating in their shadows. Jack's sisters refused to be dismissed. They understood the physical trail was evaporating by the hour. Their relentless civilian inquiry focused on the transit hub where their brother was last seen. By bypassing sluggish bureaucratic channels, they secured access to private security feeds from a local establishment near the Barking station. The grainy footage captured the early hours of the morning. It showed Jack, but he was not alone. Walking beside the heavily built warehouse worker was a tall, awkward figure. The man possessed a distinctive, slouched gait and wore a noticeably artificial blonde hairpiece. The sisters took this undeniable visual evidence directly to the station precinct. They laid the data on the desk. The constabulary's wall of apathy finally cracked. The narrative of an isolated, non-suspicious overdose was mathematically dead. A homicide investigation was retroactively triggered, driven entirely by the labor of grieving siblings. The image from the security feed was circulated through the internal police network. It did not take a master detective to connect the dots. A patrol officer stationed in the borough immediately recognized the man on the screen. It was the chef from the local bus garage. It was the resident of 58 Cook Street. It was the exact same individual who had placed the emergency call for the very first victim 15 months prior. The realization struck the precinct with the force of a physical blow. The authorities had processed 4 dead bodies within a 1,000-foot radius. They had the perpetrator in their interview room over a year ago. They had arrested him for lying about moving a corpse, and they had let him walk back to his flat to hunt 3 more times. The institutional embarrassment was absolute, quickly eclipsed by the urgent, frantic need to secure the predator before his smartphone lured a 5th target. Detectives descended on the ground floor flat. The perimeter was secured rapidly. Port was taken into custody without a physical struggle. He exhibited the same flat, emotionless demeanor that defined his digital avatars. Crime scene investigators breached the front door, stepping directly into the nucleus of the trap. The interior of the flat offered an unsettling contrast to the lethal efficiency of the crimes. It was aggressively mundane. Surfaces were cluttered with rows of children's action figures and cheap electronics. However, hidden among the juvenile detritus were the mechanics of a serial predator. Forensics recovered multiple bottles containing trace amounts of the industrial solvent. They found the blonde hair pieces used as physical camouflage. More importantly, they secured the central nervous system of the entire operation, Port's primary laptop and smartphone. The physical evidence merely corroborated the location. The real investigation would take place inside the silicon drives. Digital analysts ripped through the encrypted layers of Port's hardware. What they uncovered was a staggering chronicle of predatory calculation. The search history was not a record of recreational curiosity. It was a blueprint for murder. Analysts found hundreds of specific queries regarding the exact chemical properties of liquid ecstasy. Port had systematically researched the precise dosage required to induce a permanent coma in a 150-pound male. He studied how quickly the solvent broke down in the human bloodstream, actively seeking methods to ensure the chemical would be untraceable by standard toxicology screens. The timeline of his internet activity was damning. In the days preceding each death, Port's search volume spiked. He cross-referenced drug lethality with queries on how to dispose of dead weight. GPS metadata from his mobile device placed him exactly at the Abbey ruins during the precise early morning windows when Gabriel and Daniel were abandoned. The most devastating piece of digital evidence was a deleted text file recovered from the hard drive. It was the original draft of the forged suicide note planted on Daniel Whitworth. The digital timestamp proved Port had composed the fake confession before the young chef even arrived in Barking. The premeditation was absolute. It completely dismantled any potential defense of an accidental overdose. He had authored the cover-up before administering the poison. Furthermore, the devices held thousands of communications across various proximity applications. Detectives watched the digital trap spring shut in reverse. They read the false promises, the weaponized charm, and the calculated financial lures used to draw the targets into the quarter-mile kill zone. Port had viewed the dating grid as a takeout menu, selecting victims based on their physical vulnerability and perceived lack of social safety nets. Inside the sterile confines of the police interview room, the interrogation commenced. Port was presented with the overwhelming mountain of digital and forensic proof. His reaction lacked any human depth. There was no panic, no tearful confession, no desperate plea for understanding. He sat rigidly, his body language closed off, his eyes completely dead. He offered a weak, shifting narrative. He insisted to the detectives that the deaths were simply tragic accidents resulting from consensual encounters. He claimed the young men had voluntarily ingested the fatal doses themselves. When confronted with the recovered draft of the forged suicide note, his defense crumbled into silence. He utilized his legal right to offer no comment. He refused to articulate any genuine motive. He would not explain why he targeted those specific individuals, nor why he chose the churchyard as his personal dumping ground. The psychological profile crystallized for the investigators sitting across the table. They were dealing with an individual entirely devoid of empathy. To the killer, the victims were never human beings with families, careers, and futures. They were merely physical objects, required to fulfill an obsessive fantasy of total control. Once that control was achieved and the biological function ceased, the objects became waste, to be dragged through the dirt and discarded against stone walls. The digital mask was permanently stripped away, leaving only a cold, mechanical reality. In October 2016, the prosecution laid out the full scale of the digital slaughterhouse at the Old Bailey in London. The trial did not rely on sudden courtroom revelations. It was built on the cold, indisputable architecture of GPS coordinates, time-stamped internet searches, and the precise chemical breakdown of the industrial solvent. The jury was shown exactly how a single, unremarkable ground floor flat had been weaponized. Port maintained his fabricated narrative throughout the proceedings, insisting the lethal doses were consensual and self-administered. He attempted to present himself as a victim of tragic coincidences, a man who simply panicked when 4 separate men died on his sofa over a 15-month period. The prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. The deleted draft of the forged suicide note was the anchor of their case. That single digital file proved absolute premeditation, destroying any illusion of accidental overdose. The jury required only a few days to cut through the deception. In late November, they returned guilty verdicts for the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Caveri, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. The judge imposed a whole life order. Stephen Port will die in a high-security cell, permanently stripped of the control he spent years cultivating online. The physical predator was finally locked away. The cell door locking did not erase the profound failure of the system. In 2021, and concluding in 2022, a formal inquest brutally laid bare the institutional blindness of the local authorities. The findings were stark. Fundamental investigative errors and deep-rooted prejudice allowed a predator to operate with absolute impunity. Justice was eventually forced by grieving families, but it was neither swift nor proactive. Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, and Jack were not just victims of a killer. They were casualties of a system that simply refused to look. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.